Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. Hazel left the stable, trudging through the fresh snow toward her cozy log cabin, when a glimmer of headlights in the distance caught her eye. The beam was coming from the remote road that bordered her ranch. Living alone in her modest one-room cabin had taught her to stay alert to anything unusual. The vehicle's lights didn't move, remaining eerily still. Concerned, Hazel hurried into her home, retrieving her late father's powerful 60-power spotting scope. She kept the interior dark and positioned herself near the window, carefully observing the mysterious car. The vehicle was parked over a mile away, its shape almost lost in the thickening snowfall. Through the scope, Hazel discerned two shadowy figures stepping out from the woods and climbing back into the car. Moments later, the headlights swerved and the vehicle began heading toward the state highway. Unease settled over her as she speculated on what they might have left behind in the trees. Judging from its silhouette, the car was likely a large SUV or perhaps a compact van, but the worsening snow made it hard to be certain. She lingered by the window, watching until the car's lights disappeared into the swirling flurries. By morning, the storm would blanket the landscape in a thick, pristine layer of white. Anger bubbled up within her at the thought of someone trespassing and leaving garbage on her land. Resolute, she decided to investigate before the snow could hide any evidence. Gathering her gear, Hazel headed for the stable, saddling her horse for the trek to the site. Meanwhile, a man lay crumpled in the frigid woods, his awareness flickering in and out like a failing lantern. Pain radiated from every fiber of his being, his injuries so severe that even opening his uninjured eye was a struggle. Blood trickled down his face, clouding his vision and forcing him to blink repeatedly. When he tried to move, his body refused, each attempt crushed by a fog of confusion and pain. He couldn't recall where he was or how he had ended up in this dire state. The icy air leached the last of his body's heat, and his memories were fragmented and distant, like shards of shattered glass. He was bleeding from a gunshot wound to his side, the blood pooling on the snow beneath him and mingling with countless cuts and abrasions. From the shadows, a coyote crept closer, its nose twitching as it tracked the scent of fresh blood. The predator's yellow eyes locked on its vulnerable prey, inching nearer with each passing moment. Hazel guided her horse along the snow-covered road, her revolver secured beneath her sheepskin jacket and an old blanket draped across her saddle. Her anger simmered at the thought of anyone daring to dump waste on her land. Her horse tread carefully, its steady gait ensuring they wouldn't lose footing in the icy conditions. When she reached the spot where the vehicle had stopped, Hazel scanned for any signs of debris. The tire tracks were faint but visible, though she knew they wouldn't last long under the relentless snow. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention, and she turned sharply to see a coyote lurking in the underbrush. The animal wasn't stalking her. Its intent was clear. It was tracking something injured. Her grip on the revolver tightened, and she fired a warning shot into the ground ahead of the coyote. Startled, it darted back into the forest, but Hazel knew it wouldn't go far. She dismounted, tying her horse securely to a nearby tree, and ventured cautiously into the woods. Deeper into the trees, Hazel noticed a crimson-streaked object leaning against a trunk. As she approached, the scene became horrifyingly clear. A man was tied to the tree, his battered and bloodied body a stark contrast to the pure snow. He was stripped bare, his skin marred by vicious cuts and bruises, and a gunshot wound seeped fresh blood. Tethering her horse farther from the grisly scene, Hazel moved toward the man. He was so still she couldn't tell if he was alive. She retrieved the blanket from her saddle and carefully wrapped it around him, lifting his limp form onto her horse. With great effort, she climbed into the saddle, positioning the man across her lap before beginning the slow, careful journey back to her cabin. Once there, Hazel slid the man from the horse, dragging his heavy body inside. She laid him in front of the wood stove, the warmth gradually seeping into his cold skin. His breathing was faint but steady, a fragile sign of life. Rushing back to the stable, Hazel ensured her horse was safe, fed, and protected from the worsening storm before returning to the cabin. The man's injuries were severe. Hazel cleaned his wounds, stitching gashes across his body and applying antibiotics to stave off infection. The bullet lodged in his side posed the gravest threat. With steady hands, she extracted it, though the process was grueling. By the end, she had counted over 50 stitches along his body and face. Hours later, the man's eye fluttered open. "Everything hurts," he whispered hoarsely. "What's your name?" Hazel asked, her voice soft. "Grant," he replied faintly before succumbing to unconsciousness again. Hazel smirked. "I'll take your word for it, cowboy." Over the following days, Hazel tended to him relentlessly. The snowstorm had left her ranch isolated under 3 feet of snow, cutting off any chance of outside help. She cleaned his wounds, fed him warm broth, and ensured he stayed hydrated. As he slowly began to recover, Hazel found herself reflecting on the solitude she had embraced since her husband's death. He had been taken too soon, and the grief had driven her to retreat from the world. Now, caring for this stranger stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. Each day brought small signs of improvement, giving Hazel hope that he might survive, and in saving him, perhaps she might also rediscover a part of herself. That morning, Hazel had set out to find him and stumbled upon his lifeless form on a blanket, his body curled tightly in a fetal position. A note lay nearby, stating that he could no longer endure his illness and had ended his suffering with a bullet. On that day, a part of Hazel's spirit shattered irreparably. Those close to her recognized the depth of her grief and respected her need for solitude. For a while, they quietly checked in on her, but eventually, life resumed its usual cadence. For Hazel, interacting with others had become strictly functional. After tending to the livestock, she returned to the cabin for a coffee break. Passing the sleeping bag, she noticed the man's eyes open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "Good morning, cowboy," she said. "I see you're awake." He didn't reply, only turning his head slightly to glance at her. "Do you want some soup?" she asked. Silence. "Let's try to get you up into a chair," she continued. "Staying on the floor all the time won't do you any good." It took her nearly 10 minutes to move him to a cushioned chair about 15 feet away. Once he was settled, Hazel sat across from him on the sofa. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, his brow furrowed in thought, before finally saying, "I don't know. How long have I been here?" "About a week," she replied. "You told me your name was Hannah." He frowned. "That doesn't sound right. I don't think that's my name." "Does the name Hannah mean anything to you?" she pressed. He slowly shook his head, wincing as he moved. "What happened to me?" he asked, his voice heavy with confusion and pain. "I was hoping you could tell me," she answered. "Someone clearly wanted you dead. You were beaten and shot, left for dead." She paused before continuing. "They tied you to a tree, likely thinking they'd finished the job. I found you just in time. A coyote was circling. I brought you back here. When I got you inside, I wasn't sure you'd make it." "Where are we?" he asked weakly. "This isn't my home, is it?" Hazel chuckled softly. "No, this is my ranch. I live here alone." He leaned back in the chair and soon drifted into unconsciousness again. Hazel poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the dining table, her thoughts racing. Whoever had left him to die had meant for him to perish. They had even stripped him of his clothing, ensuring exposure would finish the job. Perhaps they hadn't realized how close the cabin was to the site of their cruelty. The sheer malice of the act left her deeply unsettled. When he stirred again, Hazel warmed a can of soup, heating it just enough to take the edge off the chill. Sitting beside him, she gently fed him spoonfuls until he turned his head away, signaling he'd had enough. She then retrieved some of her father's old clothes and dressed him. Stepping back, she said, "All right, cowboy, it's time to get you moving." With her assistance, he shuffled over to the sofa. "In a few hours, we'll make another trip back to the chair," she informed him. "It hurts," he groaned. "I know," she replied, "but it's necessary." Thus began his recovery. Hazel pushed him a little more each day. By the 5th day, he stopped resisting and began cooperating. Within 2 weeks, he was walking unassisted, albeit cautiously. 3 weeks after she had rescued him, Hazel examined him critically and said, "Well, cowboy, it's time for a bath. You're starting to smell ripe, and your wounds are healed enough for water now." She carefully undressed him and removed the last of his bandages, checking his injuries. Satisfied that the hot water wouldn't cause any harm, she filled the tub and helped him into the bathroom. Supporting him under the arms, she lowered him into the soothing water. "This feels good," he murmured. "Stay there and soak for a while," she instructed. "But don't try to get out on your own." After 20 minutes, Hazel returned to help him out, drying him off and dressing him again. He emerged from the bathroom walking steadily, without assistance. Over the following days, he continued to sleep extensively as his body recovered. Then, one morning, he joined her at the kitchen table. "Is my name really Cowboy?" he asked. Hazel smiled. "No, that's just my nickname for you since you haven't told me your real name. Sit down and have some coffee." "Who are you?" he asked, his curiosity evident. Hazel sighed. "I'm Hazel Conroy. I've owned this ranch since my father passed about a year ago, and yes, I live here alone." Though she still didn't view him as a permanent fixture on the ranch, she had no clear plan for what to do with him. "Do you have a job?" he asked. "I'm a veterinarian," she replied. "I run the ranch and work as a farrier, too." "What's a farrier?" he inquired, intrigued. "I shoe horses," she explained. "Where exactly is this ranch?" he asked. "Utah," she replied. "Those mountains out there are the Wasatch Range." He frowned, concentrating. "I don't think I'm from Utah," he said uncertainly. Hazel's expression brightened. "Well, that's something. You're starting to remember." "When I look outside, I don't see any buildings," he noted. "Where I'm from, there are lots of buildings." "See?" Hazel encouraged. "Bits and pieces are coming back to you." "You said I told you my name was Hannah. That name feels important, but I don't know why," he said thoughtfully. "Could it be someone you know?" Hazel asked. "A wife? A daughter? Your mother?" He shook his head, frustration clouding his face. "I don't know." "Think back to the night you got here," she suggested. "Do you remember a fight or anyone attacking you?" "I've been trying," he said. "I can recall 2 men, but their faces are a blur and I don't know why they did it." Hazel decided to ease off the questioning for now. Instead, she included him in her daily routines around the ranch, encouraging him to help out a little. Over time, he began to contribute more, realizing he missed the sense of purpose that work brought, even if his memories remained elusive. One afternoon, while Hazel prepared lunch, he stayed behind in the barn, continuing to work. When he finally joined her in the kitchen, he asked, "Is there an airport nearby?" Hazel paused, considering. "No major ones, just a few private airstrips on ranches." "Why?" "I just remembered something about airplanes," he said, his face a mix of hope and confusion. "Maybe I'm a pilot." Hazel had interrogated him repeatedly but found no proof he was a pilot. Then, a thought struck her, a possibility they hadn't yet explored. "What if we check online?" she proposed. "We might find something in the missing persons reports." She made her way to the computer in the living room, connected to the internet, and began poring over databases dedicated to missing persons. Most entries were for children, and the few adult profiles didn't resemble the man she had nicknamed Cowboy. Hazel combed through every resource she could recall for over 2 hours, but nothing seemed promising. Frustrated, she shut down the computer, and they resumed their tasks in the barn. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were too worn out to bother with dinner. Cowboy took the first turn in the shower, settling afterward on the fold-out cot Hazel had set up in the living room. Hazel gathered her nightclothes and retreated to her room to draw a bath. As she lowered herself into the steaming water, the tension in her body began to melt away. Her thoughts wandered, focusing on how much her life had changed since this mysterious man had entered it a month ago. Questions about his true identity churned in her mind. He was undeniably attractive, rugged, strong, and carrying himself with a quiet confidence. Hazel couldn't help but wonder what their relationship might have been like under different circumstances. Sympathy for him welled up within her. His amnesia and the lurking threat of his enemies made his predicament all the more tragic. As she scrubbed herself, immersed in thought, an unexpected rush of emotion overcame her, prompting a soft, involuntary sound. She paused, hoping Cowboy hadn't heard. It had been years since she'd felt anything remotely like this. The following morning, Hazel woke early, wrapped herself in a robe, and descended the stairs. Cowboy was still asleep on the cot, his blanket half kicked off, likely from the warmth of the wood stove. She paused, her gaze lingering on his form. Awareness flickered through her as she took in the sight, but she turned quickly and headed to the kitchen to start the coffee. Her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment, but she forced herself to stay on task. The quiet was broken by his voice. "Good morning," he said casually. Hazel flinched. For a fleeting second, she worried he might have somehow sensed her earlier thoughts. Without answering, she poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to him. "I need to head into town this morning to run some errands," she said. "You'd better stay here, just in case someone recognizes you." "Will you be safe on your own?" he asked, concern evident. She nodded, explaining she'd leave some barn chores for him to handle while she was away. After a breakfast of toast, Hazel got dressed, climbed into her truck, and drove to town. Her first stop was the bank, where she transferred funds and exchanged pleasantries with the manager. Next, she picked up her birth control pills from the pharmacy, ignoring the familiar look the pharmacist gave her, a mix of curiosity and pity. She kept taking the pills out of routine, though her love life had been dormant since her husband's passing. It wasn't that Hazel was opposed to companionship. No one in town felt like the right match. At the diner, she ordered a sandwich and coffee, briefly chatting with ranchers who sought her veterinary advice. Promising to visit their herds soon, she grabbed a newspaper from the vending box on her way out and drove to the supermarket for groceries. By the time Hazel returned home, she had enough supplies to last weeks. She unloaded her truck and began putting everything away. Cowboy, still working in the barn, soon returned when she called him in for lunch. As he ate his sandwich, Hazel skimmed through the newspaper. Suddenly, a photo caught her attention. Her heart pounded as she read the article beneath it. It felt like a lightning bolt had struck her. Setting the paper aside, she waited for Cowboy to finish eating before speaking softly. "Grant?" she ventured. He turned to her, a faint smile forming. "That's my name. How did I not remember that before?" His curiosity deepened. "But how do you know my name?" Hazel handed him the newspaper. The headline read, "Wealthy developer Grant Walker dies in plane crash." The article explained that Grant Walker had been piloting his company's plane when it went down 6 weeks earlier in a remote area of the Wasatch Mountains. Authorities couldn't account for the plane's deviation from its Denver to Dallas route. Though no body was recovered, likely due to scavengers, DNA confirmed that blood in the cockpit belonged to Grant. His wife, Hannah Walker, had since taken control of the company, with Ashton Carlson poised to become president. Grant stared at the wall, absorbing the shocking news. Hazel broke the silence. "At least now we know who you are." "It's something," he admitted, "but there's still so much that doesn't make sense. Do you think I came here from the crash site?" Hazel shook her head. "That doesn't add up. You were tied to a tree and beaten. Those injuries aren't from a plane crash. Besides, the crash site is 40 miles away. There's no way you walked here in your condition." She recounted how she had found him that day, drawn by sheer instinct. Grant buried his face in his hands. "Nothing fits." "Think carefully," Hazel urged. "Did you even get on that plane?" "I don't think I did," he admitted. "Should I reach out to my wife?" Hazel hesitated. "Grant, we don't know enough yet. Let's keep Grant Walker dead a little while longer." She placed her hand over his. "We'll figure this out." Grant nodded, though his unease was palpable. "The article says I'm wealthy, but I can't even pay you back for saving me." "You don't owe me anything," Hazel assured him. His brow furrowed, then his face lit up. "I remember something. Ashton Carlson. He's not qualified to run the company." Hazel raised an eyebrow. "Grant, stay here. I need to make a call." She pulled up the company's number on the computer, then returned to the kitchen to dial. Grant listened intently. When the receptionist answered, Hazel asked to speak with Ashton Carlson. "Who's calling?" the receptionist asked. "This is his sister," Hazel replied. Moments later, Ashton's voice came on the line. "Pat, how are you?" Hazel cut him off. "Ashton, this isn't Pat. Does sleeping with the boss's wife get you promoted to president?" There was a long, stunned pause before Ashton's voice erupted. "Who the hell is this?" Hazel ignored him, her voice steady. "Listen carefully. I have photos of you and Mrs. Walker that you're definitely going to want to see." Hazel's lips curved into a sly grin. "You might find the phone taps enlightening," she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "What are you implying?" Ashton Carlson murmured, his voice edged with caution. Hazel stifled a chuckle. "Unless you're keen on having your grand scheme implode and spending the rest of your life behind bars, you'll find a way to come up with $5 million, between the two of you." The color drained from Ashton's face. "Can we talk this through? And I'll need proof. Those pictures," he stammered, desperation creeping into his tone. Hazel's demeanor hardened instantly. "You'll hear from me about the drop-off details," she said curtly, before cutting the call. Exhaling deeply, she turned to Grant. "I hate that you had to hear all of that," she admitted. Grant's expression was strained, the weight of betrayal etched across his face. "I had my suspicions," he said quietly, his voice unsteady. "It's clear now. My wife and Ashton plotted to get rid of me. They wanted the company for themselves." He sank into a chair, his disbelief palpable. "We need to piece together everything you remember," Hazel urged, leaning closer. Grant nodded slowly, hesitation flickering in his eyes. "What you don't know can do more than hurt you," Hazel added firmly. "It could kill you." "Why were you supposed to be heading to Dallas?" she asked, studying him intently. Grant's brow furrowed. "I don't recall planning any trip to Dallas that week," he said, his tone uncertain. Hazel's eyes brightened with determination. "Then we'll need to prove you weren't on that flight, and figure out who was." She noticed a flicker of realization on his face. "What just came to you?" she pressed. "I remember their faces. The two men who attacked me," he said, his voice trembling. "But I have no idea who they are." "Burn those faces into your mind," Hazel instructed. "And explain this. How did your blood end up in the cockpit of a plane you never boarded?" Grant fell into silence, his mind churning through fragmented memories. Minutes passed before his expression shifted. "We held a blood drive a few days before you found me tied to that tree," he said suddenly. Through the night, Hazel and Grant sifted through the tangled threads of his broken memories, their progress slow but steady. Finally, as midnight crept in, Hazel stood. "We need rest. Let's pick this up tomorrow." Grant stared at the floor, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought my marriage was strong," he murmured. "Sure, things had cooled off between us, but Hannah always blamed it on work. She said the stress from leading the new urban development division was getting to her. And Ashton Carlson, he was always in her way." Hazel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Get some sleep," she said softly. After a quick shower, she slipped into her nightgown and climbed into bed, her mind swirling with the revelations of the day. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. From downstairs, she could hear Grant muttering to himself. Unable to stay in bed, she went to grab a drink. Passing through the living room, she found him lying on his back, his arms crossed over his chest as he stared at the ceiling. "What's on your mind, cowboy?" she asked lightly, the nickname slipping out naturally. Grant's face was clouded with worry. "The memories keep coming," he said, "piece by piece." "That's how it works," Hazel said gently. "Each memory unlocks another." His gaze darkened. "I can't stop wondering what I did to make her want me dead." Hazel leaned forward, cupping his face in her hands. "Don't do this to yourself. This probably has nothing to do with you and everything to do with money." She let him pull her close, holding him for a long moment before stepping back. She realized she hadn't grabbed her robe. Her silk nightgown clung to her body, and she felt a mix of vulnerability and something deeper under his lingering gaze. She let the gown fall deliberately, standing still as his eyes drank her in. When he reached for her, she allowed herself to be drawn into his embrace, their kiss deepening into passion. They made love, their connection undeniable. Afterward, Hazel rested her head on Grant's chest, overwhelmed by emotions she thought she'd buried. She'd walled herself off for so long after her husband's suicide. But now, Grant was unlocking parts of her heart she thought she'd closed forever. "I've wanted this for so long," Grant confessed, holding her tightly, "even before I was well enough to act on it." "I've wanted you too," Hazel admitted, "but I've been terrified to open up again." She shared the pain of her past, her husband's death driving her into isolation. Grant kissed her tenderly. "I hope you're ready to stop hiding," he whispered. As morning light spilled into the room, Hazel awoke to find Grant already up. After a shower, she joined him in the kitchen where coffee was waiting. "We need to tend to the animals," she said, glancing at the clock. "Already done," Grant said with a grin. "I even cleaned the stalls." Hazel blinked. "It's 9:30? I haven't slept this late since I was a kid." Grant chuckled, pulling her into a hug. "I guess I wore you out," he teased. Hazel smiled but quickly turned serious. "Grant, my life's been so small since my husband died. I can't risk my heart again. And you're still married." Grant's expression darkened. "My marriage is over, Hazel. She tried to kill me. And I told you last night how much I care about you. I've loved you since I woke from my coma." Hazel gestured for him to sit beside her. "Let's talk about your memories. Are there still missing pieces?" Grant took her hands. "Just the last day or two before you found me." Hazel nodded, sensing that while they'd uncovered much, their journey was far from over. Hazel gently clasped his hand, her voice calm and reassuring. "What you went through, whether it was on that day or even before, might be too overwhelming for your mind to process all at once," she said softly. "But I'm confident those memories will surface when the time is right." Grant acknowledged her words with a nod, piecing together fragments of the past that lingered in his mind. "I run a development company, a fairly successful one," he shared. After a moment of reflection, he added, "I took over the business from my father about 5 years ago after he passed away. We manage large-scale construction projects, particularly in water and wastewater systems. I even launched a specialized division for it, which has earned us a solid reputation. About 4 years ago, I got married." Grant paused briefly, his tone more reserved as he continued. "My wife was an engineer in that division. My friends used to joke that she was the one pursuing me, not the other way around. She was incredibly driven. Honestly, I thought she'd eventually start her own firm. Last year, I was honored with the Excellence Award from Engineering News Record." Hazel's eyebrows lifted in curiosity. "Is that a prestigious award?" she asked. "It is," he confirmed. "I was the youngest person ever to receive it." "How old are you?" she inquired, her expression curious. Grant smirked. "Are you trying to figure out if I'm husband material?" Hazel flushed, her cheeks glowing red. "I'm 37, she admitted, her voice quiet. "And you?" 39, he replied, a playful grin on his face. "What about your wife?" Hazel asked tentatively. "If you're wondering whether I still have feelings for her or want her back, the answer is a hard no," he stated firmly. "All I feel for her now is revulsion." Grant's grip on her hands tightened as he gazed into her eyes. "Hazel, I'd gladly spend my life here with you on this ranch, but I need closure. I need to uncover the truth about what happened to me and why. Will you help me?" he asked earnestly. Hazel's eyes filled with tears, her throat tightening to the point where speaking was impossible. She simply nodded. Grant stood and pulled her close, holding her in a tender embrace before kissing her softly. She rested her head on his shoulder, finding comfort in his presence. "Do you think we could spend some time getting to know each other better now that most of the chores are done?" she asked, her voice a gentle whisper. Grant smiled warmly, taking her hand and leading her upstairs. They spent the afternoon strengthening their bond and mapping out their next steps. Their conversation turned to the evidence they needed to hold Hannah and Ashton accountable for their actions. "Do you have anyone in Denver you trust completely?" Hazel asked. Grant thought for a moment. My father's former secretary comes to mind. She was like a second mother to me after my mom passed away. I've always suspected there was more to her relationship with my father than just work. She's nearing retirement now, and I've made plans to ensure she's well taken care of when she steps away. Hazel's face lit up. She might be able to help us. Let's start with her. Should we involve the police? Hazel asked cautiously. Grant shook his head. Not yet. Doing that would only give Hannah time to cover her tracks. She'd probably shift all the blame onto Ashton. They decided Denver would be their starting point. Grant believed he'd been left at Hazel's ranch because of its remote location. Hazel speculated that whoever abandoned him hadn't noticed her cabin and barn due to the snowstorm and her decision to keep the lights off. Together, they began sketching out their next moves. We can rent a small camper in town and drive to Denver, Hazel suggested. I'll stay at a motel under my name and handle contacting Hannah or Ashton if needed. Meanwhile, we'll meet your father's secretary and gather evidence before involving law enforcement. Hazel wrapped her arms around Grant in a tight hug. Spring's on its way, she murmured. Tomorrow's Thursday. I need to see a few clients, but I'll also arrange for a camper. Friday, we'll head to Denver and meet your friend. The rest we'll figure out along the way. That evening, they worked side by side preparing dinner, exchanging light-hearted banter. Afterward, Grant tackled the dishes while Hazel fed the animals and organized her medical bag for the next day. She even arranged for a neighbor's son to care for her livestock during their trip. When the chores were finally done, Hazel leaned into Grant's embrace. When my husband took his own life, it shattered me, she admitted quietly. I shut myself off from the world until you showed up. Please be patient with me as I navigate my feelings. What we're about to do is risky, and I can't bear the thought of losing you or getting hurt again. Grant kissed her softly. I'll never intentionally hurt you, Hazel. Later, they shared the warmth of each other's arms in bed, finding solace in their connection. As they drifted to sleep, Hazel whispered, I love you, her words stirring a surge of emotions in Grant's heart. The next morning, Hazel headed to town while Grant kept busy around the ranch. She rented a compact camper, noting that its tinted windows and blinds would be perfect for discreet surveillance. She also picked up a baseball cap and sunglasses for Grant to help him stay inconspicuous. When she returned, she found Grant repairing parts of the barn. I found some tools and thought I'd make myself useful, he said with a smile. As Hazel inspected his work, she realized just how much the property had been neglected. You're quite the rancher, she teased. This place feels like home, he replied, his words touching her deeply. She hugged him tightly, grateful for his presence. That evening, they finalized their plans. They decided to pick up the camper early the next morning to avoid drawing attention. Turning in early, they shared another intimate moment before drifting off to sleep. At the break of dawn, they departed the ranch. Grant, wearing his new hat and sunglasses, sat beside Hazel as she drove them into town. The journey to Denver, and the answers they desperately sought, awaited them. The dealer granted their request, and they began gathering the supplies necessary for their mission. Among the items packed were clothing, a camera, and various essentials. Grant pulled the pickup truck into its spot as Hazel maneuvered the RV to the lot's entrance. Their drive to Denver was smooth, with Hazel handling all the driving due to Grant's lack of both identification and a driver's license. By early afternoon, they arrived in the city and began searching for a place to stay. After some scouting, they settled on a modest, family-run motel on the outskirts of Denver and started unpacking their belongings. While Hazel prepared the camera, Grant sifted through the motel's stationery and local phone books, jotting down numbers he thought might be helpful. To minimize the risk of recognition, Hazel went alone to a nearby fast food restaurant to pick up their dinner, which they ate back at the motel. After the meal, they drove to the home of a trusted secretary in Grant's network. As they parked outside her house, Grant noted the absence of her car. She must still be at work, he remarked to Hazel. Around 5:45 p.m., a car pulled into the driveway, parking under the carport. Grant and Hazel exited their vehicle and approached as the driver stepped out. "Lily?" Grant called out gently. The woman froze, staring at him in shock as he removed his dark glasses. "Oh my God," she whispered, before beginning to faint. Grant caught her just before she hit the ground. Hazel quickly retrieved Lily's keys from her purse and unlocked the front door. Grant carried Lily inside, placing her carefully on the living room sofa. Hazel fetched a glass of water from the kitchen, and by the time she returned, Lily was beginning to stir. Her eyes fluttered open as she reached out to touch Grant's face. "You're alive?" she whispered in disbelief. "You're not dead?" "No, I'm not dead," Grant assured her, gripping her hand tightly. It took her several minutes to process the shock. She repeatedly murmured, "You're alive?" before she finally sat up. Grant and Hazel stayed close, offering her comfort as she regained her composure. "Everyone thought you had died," Lily said, her voice tinged with awe. "For now, I need them to keep thinking that," Grant replied calmly. Lily's gaze shifted to Hazel, curiosity evident. "And who is this?" she asked. Grant explained how Hazel had found him, nursed him back to health, and cared for him during his recovery. As he described his critical condition at the time, tears filled Lily's eyes. She turned to Hazel, her voice heavy with gratitude. "Thank you for saving him. He's like the son I never had." Her expression turned serious as she asked, "What happened to you, Grant? Why did you disappear that day at the restaurant?" Grant's face clouded as he tried to recall. "Lily, I've been suffering from memory loss because of the severe beating I endured. My recollection is fragmented. I was hoping you might help fill in the blanks." They moved to the kitchen, where Lily poured herself another glass of water. She began recounting the events as she remembered them. "You asked me to gather records for the PUD division that Hannah oversaw. You said you needed to meet her and Ashton Carlson at the restaurant to discuss the division's future. I knew there'd be tension because the division was losing money. You even booked a private room to avoid any public drama." Lily's distaste for Ashton Carlson was evident in her tone every time she mentioned his name. "While you were at the restaurant, someone came in and said there was smoke coming from under your car's hood. You stepped outside to check, and that was the last time anyone saw you. About 6 weeks later, the authorities found the wreckage of your plane in Utah and declared you dead. But Grant, why didn't you tell me about the flight? You always had me arrange those things." Grant's gaze drifted, his mind churning. Hazel noticed his distant expression. "Grant, are you remembering something?" she asked softly. He nodded slowly. "Yes, there was a van parked next to my car. When I leaned in to inspect the engine, 2 men jumped out, threw a sheet over my head, and struck me hard enough to knock me nearly unconscious." His voice grew quieter. "I recognized them. They were former employees I fired for failing drug tests." Grant asked Lily for any additional details about the meeting. "Hannah and Ashton showed up late, about 25 minutes after you left," she said. "They waited an hour and then left too. Later, your car was found at the airport. Hannah told me to check with the mechanic about the company plane, but he said he never saw you board it. The FAA only had vague records of who filed the flight plan." Lily's voice broke. "The day after you vanished, Hannah reassigned me to the warehouse. She claimed the company was shifting directions and said I'd be happier there. Everything happened so fast." The emotional toll of reliving these events was clear. Lily slumped in her chair, visibly drained. Grant and Hazel shared the progress they had made in their own investigation and urged Lily to temporarily leave her house for her safety. Hazel also suggested notifying the police to ensure the house would be monitored during her absence. After packing enough belongings for a week, Lily joined them back at the motel. Hazel secured her a room next door. That evening, as exhaustion set in, Hazel ordered Chinese food for delivery. During dinner, Grant asked about accessing his personal finances. Lily's face brightened. "Your personal account. I kept the ATM card for emergencies. It's not connected to the company and the statements are mailed to my house." Relief washed over Grant. "That's exactly what we need. Thank you, Lily." She apologized for not remembering sooner, but he reassured her. "I trust you completely. Don't worry." Fatigue finally overcame Lily, and she retired to her room. Before leaving, she provided Grant with Ashton Carlson's phone number. The next day, they planned to buy a prepaid phone to avoid being traced. As Hazel stretched and prepared for bed, Grant teased her. She patted the spot beside her, inviting him to lie down. Their time together was tender, filled with warmth and affection. Hazel confessed her love for Grant, and he embraced her, cherishing her words. In the quiet moments that followed, their bond deepened, strengthened by the challenges they had faced and the connection they had found in one another. Hazel and Grant started their morning by sharing a shower. After getting dressed, Hazel knocked on Lily's door to let her know she was heading out to grab breakfast from McDonald's. A short walk later, Hazel returned from the fast food restaurant 2 blocks away, carrying coffee and meals for the 3 of them. They sat together to eat, discussing their next steps to uncover the truth. While strategizing, Grant kept pressing Lily with questions and discovered something startling. Hannah had postponed the company's annual financial audit. She had claimed the delay was necessary due to Grant's disappearance, citing the need for additional time to organize the records. The news didn't sit well with Grant. "She's either stealing or covering up something," he said, his tone dark. Turning back to Lily, he asked, "Have there been any major purchases while I've been gone?" Lily hesitated before responding. "Both Hannah and Ashton bought brand new Lincoln Navigator SUVs." Grant's expression grew stern. "These are automobiles costing $54,000. How did they justify such an expenditure?" "They claimed they needed the vehicles for trips to Los Angeles to secure a critical contract," Lily replied. Grant's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "What contract?" Lily explained. "The water treatment project you were working on before you disappeared. Didn't you know it was finalized?" Shaking his head, Grant began piecing things together. He recalled the project's immense potential for profit, but also remembered identifying engineering issues that would lead to costly change orders. Although he had flagged these concerns, the engineers had been reluctant to amend the contract due to anticipated resistance from the city. Still, Grant knew the overseeing agency often approved change orders without much pushback. "It's time to disrupt their plans," Grant declared. They prepared to leave the motel, and despite Hazel and Grant's objections, Lily insisted on coming along. Along the way, Hazel stopped at Staples to buy a prepaid cell phone. They then drove to Grant's office, where they staked out the parking lot. Shortly after, they saw Hannah and Ashton arrive in separate vehicles. From their vantage point, Grant observed Hannah's agitated body language as she spoke to Ashton. He frowned. "I wish I could hear what they're saying," he murmured. Once the pair disappeared inside, Hazel drove them to a local newspaper archive. While Hazel sifted through old articles, Grant and Lily waited out of sight in the back of the van. Breaking the silence, Lily started a conversation. "Hazel seems like a good person," she began. "You two seem close. Am I wrong?" Grant hesitated before admitting, "She saved my life. Things between us have developed more than either of us expected." Smirking, Lily said, "Figured it out last night. The motel's walls aren't exactly soundproof. Let's just say I didn't get much rest." Blushing, Grant stammered an apology, but Lily reached over and squeezed his hand. "Grant, I'm genuinely happy for you," she said warmly. "Hannah was never the right person for you. I always suspected something off about her, but didn't know how to bring it up. I regret not speaking out sooner." Grant sighed. "I wish you had." "Don't let Hazel slip away," Lily urged. "She's exactly what you need." After a pause, Grant ventured, "Lily, I need to ask you something personal. Were you and my father involved?" Tears welled in Lily's eyes. "Yes. After your mother passed, we became lovers. We even talked about getting married, but when he was diagnosed with cancer, he ended it. He didn't want to burden me and wanted to focus on securing the company's future for you." Grant's brow furrowed. "Why didn't he marry you before he got sick?" "He thought it would dishonor your mother's memory," Lily answered softly. "That's ridiculous," Grant said sharply. "You've been like a mother to me. He robbed you both of happiness." Lily's tone turned firm. "Don't repeat his mistake. If you let Hazel go, I'll never forgive you." Their conversation ended when Hazel returned to the van, carrying a stack of documents. "Interesting," she said. "The FAA, NTSB, and FBI are all investigating the crash. That's unusual." Grant frowned. Why would the FBI be involved? The articles don't explain, but there's speculation about company restructuring and the sale of several divisions, Hazel replied. Grant's temper flared. Drive back to the office. There's no reason for a restructuring, let alone selling off divisions. They parked near the office and waited until Hannah and Ashton emerged around 6 in the evening. The pair lingered briefly in the parking lot before leaving in their vehicles. Hazel followed at a safe distance until Grant instructed her to stop. They're either going to my house or Ashton's. Let's wait. They pulled into a Burger King drive-thru to grab food, and Grant ate his meal in brooding silence. Once he calmed, Hazel asked what he planned to do next. We're going to beat them at their own game, Grant said, pulling out the prepaid phone. They drove to his house and parked several blocks away, out of sight. Both SUVs were in the driveway. With a mischievous grin, Grant said, "Time to make a call." Hazel dialed the number he provided. When Hannah answered, Hazel spoke in a cold, calculated tone. "Hello, Hannah. I've got some tapes and photos you might find interesting." "Who is this?" Hannah demanded. Ignoring her question, Hazel continued, "I heard Ashton's share is $5 million. Yours is the same." Hannah's voice rose in panic. "I can't raise that kind of money." Hazel's tone turned icy. "Kidnapping, murder, conspiracy, assault. The list goes on. Sounds like decades in prison, maybe life." Hannah's frantic shouting was suddenly interrupted by footsteps outside the van. Realizing they were being hunted, Hazel ended the call and smiled. That should keep her busy. Before Hannah could get a word in, Hazel quickly cut her off. "I'll call you tomorrow with the delivery details. Make sure your secretary knows to take calls from someone named Betty." She didn't wait for a response and ended the call abruptly, leaving Hannah yelling in frustration on the other end. Turning to Grant, Hazel caught his amused grin as he gave Lily a light nudge. "Note to self, never get on your bad side," he joked. Grant suggested they head back to the motel. The events of the day had left the women riding a high, but Grant remained focused. He asked Lily if she could recall the names of the 2 men she had fired after they failed a test. Although he described their appearances, Lily could only remember one name, Rick Ulrich. Grant quickly formulated a plan. "Hazel, tomorrow you're going to call Ulrich and accuse him of kidnapping me. You're going to demand $10,000 for my silence. From there, we'll try to figure out who else was involved." Back at the motel, the group gathered to review the day's events, making sure they hadn't overlooked anything important. "If we can confirm Ulrich's involvement," Grant continued, "our next step is going to the FBI. This is a kidnapping case that crosses state lines. They'll have jurisdiction." Lily agreed but excused herself early, saying she needed sleep. She declined Hazel's offer to grab dinner and retreated to her room. Hazel and Grant, still restless, decided to turn in as well, but not before sharing a quiet, intimate moment before falling asleep. The next morning, they skipped breakfast, too anxious about what lay ahead. With the phone number and address Grant had found in a phone book, they left the motel to track down Ulrich. Hazel drove as Grant gave directions to Ulrich's Street, a once thriving neighborhood that now bore the marks of neglect. Hazel parked a little distance away, giving Grant a clear line of sight to Ulrich's house. Hazel picked up the phone and dialed the number. A rough voice answered. "Yeah?" "Mr. Ulrich, this is Karen Hughes," Hazel began smoothly. "My son accidentally backed into your car earlier. He panicked and rushed home to tell me. I'd like to come by this afternoon to provide my insurance details. Would that work for you?" Before he could respond, she quickly added, "Great, see you then," and ended the call. The group watched the house closely, waiting to see if Ulrich would take the bait. Minutes later, a man emerged barefoot, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Grant nodded. "That's him. We're making progress." Ulrich walked around his car, scrutinizing it and muttering before heading back inside. Grant placed a hand on Hazel's shoulder. "It's time to involve the FBI." He flipped through the motel's phone book and found the nearest FBI field office. Following his directions, they arrived at the office within 20 minutes. Inside, they approached the front desk. Grant, unsure how to begin, blurted out, "My name is Grant Walker and I'm supposed to be dead." Hazel stifled a laugh at his bluntness. The receptionist blinked, clearly startled, and quickly called someone. A moment later, she informed them that an agent was on the way. A young agent appeared, stared at Grant in shock, and disappeared back into the secure area. Shortly after, he returned with a female agent. "Mr. Walker," she said, extending a hand, "please come with me." As Grant followed, two other agents appeared, positioning themselves near the exit as though anticipating trouble. "You'll want to speak with these two as well," Grant said, motioning to Hazel and Lily. The trio was led to an interrogation room, where they were offered refreshments, but declined. The female agent introduced herself as Special Agent Karen Carter, and the young man as Special Agent Howard. Two additional agents remained stationed behind them. "Mr. Walker," Carter began, "can you tell us where you've been?" Grant detailed his kidnapping and the events that followed, with Hazel filling in about his injuries and the care she provided. "So, you're a doctor?" Carter asked Hazel. "No, I'm a veterinarian," Hazel replied. "A blizzard made getting him to a hospital impossible." Carter smiled at her candidness. After whispering something to Howard, Carter continued asking questions, occasionally repeating them to cross-check details. Howard soon returned, nodded at Carter, and she turned to Grant. "Mr. Walker, please come with me." Grant was taken to another room where a doctor examined his scars, taking photographs as Agent Carter observed. Once finished, Grant dressed and rejoined Hazel and Lily, who were still being questioned by Howard. A phone call interrupted the session, and Carter stepped out to take it. She returned moments later. "Mr. Walker, we apologize for the invasive process. We needed to verify your injuries weren't self-inflicted. We've been looking for you since your disappearance." Grant asked how they were so sure he wasn't dead. Carter explained, "The crash site didn't have any body parts, not even bones, which predators wouldn't have entirely removed. Your reputation as a skilled pilot made it improbable you'd fly into a storm or skip pre-flight checks. And finally, your wife's haste in declaring you dead raised red flags. Most spouses take longer before taking that step." Grant nodded thoughtfully. "We need to bring the perpetrators to justice. I know one of the men involved and have a plan to expose them." He proposed that Hazel call Ulrich, posing as a blackmailer to arrange a meeting with both him and his accomplice. "But I won't risk her safety again," Grant added. Carter reassured him. "We'll have someone else make the call." They planned the strategy carefully. "Where should I tell them to meet?" Hazel asked. Carter suggested a location near the FBI office, guaranteeing the area would be secure. Hazel stepped outside to place the call, as cell phones didn't work in the building. When she returned moments later, she was smiling. "It's set," she announced. The plan was officially in motion. She wore a sly grin. "Looks like the fool swallowed the hook," she remarked, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She'd made it non-negotiable. Both men had to show up, or the deal was off. By mid-afternoon, a young female agent, inconspicuously dressed and wired with recording equipment, was stationed inside a parked car outside the insurance office. She appeared casual, ready to blend in seamlessly. Meanwhile, Agent Carter coordinated efforts with Grant, borrowing his van to serve as a makeshift command post. Grant agreed without hesitation. Around 5:40 p.m., a vehicle pulled into the parking lot carrying two men. The men surveyed the area with suspicion, then left the lot, circling the block before returning moments later. Satisfied after their second inspection, they parked again and cautiously stepped out. Approaching the solitary car in the lot, they didn't notice the undercover agent positioning herself strategically to give the SWAT team the best chance to act. She exited her car and strode toward them with calculated confidence. Rick Ulrich broke the silence first. "You're waiting for us, aren't you?" he asked. "That's right," she replied without hesitation. "I saw you snatch that man in the parking lot. Bet the cops would pay a fortune to find out who's behind it." Ulrich's expression darkened. "How do you even know who he is?" "I read the news," she said smoothly. "Everyone's looking for that Walker guy." Ulrich's lip curled in a sneer as he grabbed her arm. "Not too sharp, are you, sweetheart? We'll deal with you the same way we dealt with him. But first, we'll have a little fun." He began pulling her toward his vehicle. Agent Carter's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie. "Move in! We've got them!" Within seconds, the SWAT team emerged from their concealed positions, from behind bushes, rooftops, even the agent's car trunk. The men were swiftly tackled, restrained, and taken into custody. The suspects were transported to the field office in less than 2 minutes. There, they were placed in a lineup, where Grant identified them as the ones responsible for abducting, assaulting, and shooting him. Later, Grant joined Lily and Hazel in the interrogation room, where Agent Carter entered, her expression triumphant. "This case just cracked wide open," she announced, a gleam in her eye. "They're singing like birds." Her grin turned mischievous. "Grant, care to face them? It might make them think twice about lying." Grant agreed and was led to the room holding Rick Ulrich. At the sight of him, Ulrich went pale, breaking into uncontrollable sobs. Grant was then escorted to the second suspect's room, where the man immediately blamed Ulrich, insisting he'd been forced to participate under threat of death. Carter quickly intervened, pulling Grant out before he could respond. "That's the guy who shot me," Grant said grimly. "He thought I was already dead." "His name is Steve Sandoz," Carter explained. "He's wanted for multiple crimes across state lines." Later, Carter laid out the plan to apprehend Hannah and Ashton. Both were attending a high-profile event alongside Congressman and the mayor, making their arrest too risky in public. Instead, the FBI tracked their movements through the night and staked out their residences when they returned home. "Agent Carter," Grant ventured, "can I confront my wife during the arrest?" "Follow my orders to the letter," she warned. "No arguments, no revenge." The group returned to their motel under FBI protection. Agents monitored every entrance as everyone turned in for the night. Hazel and Grant held each other close until sleep finally came. By morning, Carter drove the group to Grant's office building, parking discreetly. When Hannah and Ashton arrived, Carter opted to arrest them inside to minimize danger to bystanders. 30 minutes later, 6 agents and Grant entered the building. Carter stopped at the receptionist's desk, instructing another agent to prevent any calls from being made. The team took the elevator to Hannah's floor. In the waiting area, an agent moved the secretary aside, sternly warning her against alerting Hannah. Trembling, she nodded in compliance. With firearms drawn, Carter and 2 agents entered Hannah's office. Hannah, rummaging through a drawer, froze as Carter barked, "Hands where I can see them!" Hannah obeyed, but as an agent moved to handcuff Ashton, she suddenly pulled a revolver from the drawer and pressed it to her temple. The agents lunged, but it was too late. The gun discharged, and Hannah collapsed, blood splattering across the desk and wall. Chaos erupted as the FBI secured the scene. Grant was ushered to a car where Hazel and Lily were waiting. Ashton was quickly transported to the field office. Meanwhile, Carter contacted her supervisor, and law enforcement flooded the scene. Back at the field office, Grant struggled to recount the grim events to Hazel and Lily. Eventually, he was taken aside for questioning, enduring hours of interrogation from various agents. By evening, Carter returned with news. "You're free to go," she said. "Can Hazel return to Utah?" Grant asked. "Yes," Carter confirmed. "If we need her, she'll be back within 12 hours, understood?" Grant nodded. "And the agent who blocked me?" he pressed. Carter's expression hardened. "His career is over. Mistakes like that are unacceptable. The press will have a field day." She shook Grant's hand before leading him to an FBI vehicle. Back at the motel, Hazel and Grant lay together, though sleep remained elusive. By morning, they rose, showered, dressed, and shared a quiet breakfast. "It feels good not having to hide anymore," Grant remarked. Hazel searched his face for any sign of lingering pain. "Are you really okay?" she asked. He pulled her into an embrace. "As long as I have you, I'll be fine." He kissed her gently. She looked away, hesitant. "I'll need to return to the ranch soon," she admitted. "What's next for you?" "First, I'll sort out this mess," Grant replied. "Then, I'll ask you to marry me." "Will it be long distance?" she asked cautiously. He held her tightly. "I've got some ideas. Just don't give up on me." Hazel rested her head on his shoulder. They ate in silence, both uncertain about the future. After breakfast, Grant insisted on visiting his office, where his employees greeted him warmly, as though he'd never been gone. Grant contacted the maintenance team, instructing them to reach out to the Lincoln dealership and arrange for replacement keys for both SUVs. When the new sets arrived, he handed one to Hazel. "This is for you," he said with determination. "I'm going to buy these cars from the company. We don't need such expensive vehicles for business." Hazel paused, uncertainty in her voice. "But I still have to return the van to Utah." Grant had already thought ahead. "I'll take care of that. I'll hire a rollback truck to tow it back," he assured her. Meanwhile, Lily, adamant about returning to her job, quickly became the focus of attention at work. Hazel lingered, reluctant to part from Grant, but eventually she sighed and admitted, "I suppose it's time for me to head back to Utah." Grant wasn't ready to let her leave without a proper goodbye. Pulling her close, he kissed her deeply. "I'll handle everything as fast as I can and come to you," he promised. "I'll call you every day. I already miss you and you haven't even gone." Hazel, fighting back tears, climbed into the SUV. She leaned out to kiss him once more before starting the engine and driving away. Grant stood motionless, watching her vehicle fade into the distance, his heart heavy with the temptation to follow her. Hazel drove for miles, her face wet with tears. Back home in Utah, she threw herself into the relentless demands of ranch life, working until sheer exhaustion claimed her each night. Despite her efforts, the emptiness of the house loomed large. Her voice echoed off the walls, amplifying her loneliness. True to his word, Grant called multiple times a day, his voice filled with love and reassurance. Their nightly conversations turned intimate, filled with dreams of the life they would build together. Though his words comforted her, they couldn't replace the warmth of his presence. Over time, Hazel's doubts began to fade, replaced by a growing certainty that their love was unshakable. One afternoon, a package arrived at her door. Inside was a cell phone from Grant, ensuring they could always stay connected. For weeks, their routine of daily calls continued without fail. But one morning, exactly 5 weeks after she had returned, the phone didn't ring. Hazel's heart sank. Was this the beginning of a drift between them? By midday, her unease turned to panic. Unable to focus, she retreated to the cabin, overwhelmed by a hollow despair. As she stared listlessly out the window, a movement on the state road caught her attention. A car was approaching. As it drew nearer, she recognized it. A Lincoln SUV. Heart-pounding, she dashed outside just as Grant pulled up and stepped out of the car. Without hesitation, she flung herself into his arms, squeezing him so tightly that he winced. "You're crushing me," he said, laughing. "Why didn't you call?" she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. Grant smiled and reached into his pocket, producing a small box. "Because I wanted to give you something in person," he explained. Opening the box, he revealed a dazzling diamond ring. Sliding it onto her finger, he asked, "Hazel, will you marry me?" Hazel's tear-filled eyes locked onto his. "I asked you once, are we really going to keep doing this long-distance thing?" Grant laughed and wrapped an arm around her as they walked inside. "Not anymore," he replied. Once inside, he set a stack of documents on the table. "I've taken care of everything. From now on, I'll run the company from here. I've hired a top-tier president to manage daily operations, and I'll stay on as CEO. With modern technology, I can work from anywhere. I even thought we could build a runway on the ranch so I can travel when needed. What do you think?" He went on to explain that a team of tech specialists would soon install a system giving him full access to the company's files from the ranch. Taking her hands in his, he gazed into her eyes. "We're going to have an incredible life together, Hazel. Homes in Colorado and Utah, and a man who loves you more than anything. But you still haven't answered. Will you marry me?" Without hesitation, Hazel threw her arms around him. "Yes, I'll marry you," she whispered. Then, with a mischievous glint in her eyes, she added, "But first, let's head to bed. You've got 5 weeks to make up for." Taking his hand, she led him toward the bedroom, ready to embrace the life they had waited so long to begin. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, Then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.